It's Fill Your Plate Now, where every bite brings you closer to the farm gate and further from what's unhealthy. Now here's your hosts, Julie and Tammy, helping you live well by filling your plate well.
So Tammy, on this episode of Fill Your Plate Now, we're going to talk about soil health. And you'll appreciate this as a nutritionist because we need healthy soil to produce healthy food.
Absolutely. And this is a topic that comes up pretty frequently.
Yeah.
Regenerating the soil, how healthy is the soil?
Right.
I think this is going to be fascinating.
And our guest today is going to be Jeffrey Silvertooth. But before I bring him on, I'm going to talk about a little bit of research that I did. A couple associates of mine, even in the course of interviews that we've done, stuff like that, the claim is that American soil has been depleted to the point of significantly reducing the vitamin and mineral content of the fruits and vegetables that we grow. So I thought, is that true? Well, guess what? It's not true. The scientific evidence, if you investigate it, and I spent a whole weekend kind of poring over some of this information, it's just not true. And one of the things that I want to highlight for our listeners is that our farmers throughout the United States, across America, they're doing their job to take care of their soil and to make it healthy. There's going to be variations, and Dr. Silvertooth will get into that with us. But as I researched some of these studies, the evidence isn't conclusive. There's limitations. There was, for example, a study in 2004 by Davis, and put in the Journal of the American College of Nutrition. Ultimately, they said the study relies on historical food composition data, which can be inconsistent due to differences in measurement techniques and stuff like that. So it's hard to compare apples to apples, to use the fruit metaphor, or oranges to oranges. And it's important to note that our farmers today are doing a very efficient job of taking care of their soils. So I wanted to make sure I dispelled that myth, and I think this session is going to allow us to do that.
Well, and it's so important because the condition of the soil is going to affect the condition of the crops and the quality of the product. So
right.
I can't wait to hear more about this.
Yes. So I've brought on Dr. Jeffrey Silvertooth. He's a professor and extension specialist in agronomy and soil science in the Department of Environmental Science at the University of Arizona, our land-grant university. He has served on the U of A faculty and worked statewide and throughout the desert Southwest and extension and research since 1987. I don't want to age you that much, but for some time. And I have known Dr. Silvertooth, I want to say, probably since high school, and he and Dad were solid colleagues together at one of the University of Arizona's extension or experiment stations. And he and Dad have all sorts of stories that they can tell. And Dr. Silvertooth, you've been recognized as a fellow for both the American Society of Agronomy and Soil Science Society of America. So we are bringing on the expert. And I'm going to dive right in, Dr. Silvertooth, and ask you the big question. Some claim that today's cultivated soils across the United States have lost a percentage of their quote-unquote soil health due to modern-day agriculture practices, from their perspective, depleting soil. Do you believe this is the cause? Why or why not? Or is this actually an issue?
Well, that's a great question. And first of all, let me thank you for having me on the program with you. I really appreciate the chance to join you and just have this discussion. And direct answer to your question, Julie, that you posed right off the bat, it's one of those things where it says, well, it depends. And universally, categorically speaking, no, we have not universally depleted these soils. There's claims that industrial agriculture, commercial agriculture, large-scale modern agriculture is ruining all soils. That's categorically false. What you can say is this, that in some cases, it might be, but they're relatively rare cases, where the soils have been depleted because of crop uptake and lack of proper management, lack of fertilization. But I will tell you, in my almost 50 years of being in agriculture and 40 years, 39 years exactly, being here in Arizona, working in the desert Southwest, those cases are extremely rare. and we don't see them anymore. But folks that have had those kinds of problems on their farms just don't last in business. And so it becomes a matter of survival, really, and survival of the fittest. Those that do the best job managing stay in business. And we have to fertilize, we have to manage soils. The key point of all of this is we can't discuss any of it in a broad universal, with a broad brush and universally. I think what we have to do is always look at as we do in reality, look at each situation on a case-by-case basis. It's the same thing as relation to, we can make a lot of analogies when talking about soil health as we would like human health. And not every individual is the same. Not every case is the same. We have to take each of them individually, but we have to have some common metrics and understand what we're doing. And we have to have some understanding about what are the proper methods to address the problems that we do find.
Yeah. And you're the one that taught me, even within the same field, the soils can be different. So, and your boots on the ground, you have hung out with our farmers here in the Southwest. You've seen them in practice, and
Right.
they're amazing when it comes to taking care of their health.
Yeah, and I love the analogy with people not being the same and all soil being a little bit different, and along that line, I mean, we've seen huge technological advances in medicine for people.
Right.
And when you look at ergonomics of the 70s, could you tell us a little bit about how it's evolved into the regenerative agriculture today and some of the differences or some of the things we've learned?
Yeah, that's a great question too, Tammy. Sometimes we look at some of this, it's kind of like the old is now new, and the things kind of recycle a little bit. I have related sometimes, and sometimes Julie and I have had some discussions where I can relate back to times where I was working on farms in southern Kansas, northern Oklahoma, and I would say a lot of the practices that the farmers, now those were what we call dry land farming conditions, I must say. We are non-irrigated, they're rain-fed, and back there we call them dry land. But all those cases are completely dependent on rainfall. Southern Kansas, that part of the world, we probably got about like 24 inches of rainfall a year, something like that. So it's in that kind of moderate Great Plains kind of region with regard to humidity. And the conditions that the farmers that I was working with were employing were a lot of those factors, a lot of those practices that we would call today as optimum conditions for regenerative farming. People moved away from that for a little while as a result of trying to expedite operations in the field as farms began to expand and equipment began to change. But what we've seen is that we're needing to get back to some of those fundamentals. And the fundamentals involve things like we advocate today as crop rotations, crop cover, minimum tillage, reduced tillage, conservation tillage. And a lot of it has to do with that. And people in the past 40 years have really transitioned back remarkably in many parts of the country like that. And it's also true in irrigated conditions, although in irrigated conditions we have to manage it a little differently because we still have to maintain the soils and the surface of the soil so that we can irrigate. But that's a great question in terms of, what are the practices of the past and how do they relate today? And what are some of the things that we're gaining or relearning from practices in the past? You could take that a step further and go back to the men and women I was working with as a youngster on the plains in the 70s. And they had come through the Dust Bowl. They'd been through early stages of opening the prairies and having the first crops, and they'd seen the changes that had taken place. They were strong advocates of good land stewardship, and they were strong advocates of implementing those practices that we're describing today. So they've changed in one direction, probably for not as optimal in the past, right after like the 80s, maybe early 90s, but rapidly in the past, say 25, 30 years, they've been shifting back into more of those fundamental kind of practices. And I really see it when I go out in the plains today or travel around the country. And certainly we see it here in Arizona as well as transitions have been taking place.
And can you be a little bit more specific on some of those distinctions between regenerative and just regular? Because I know for my dad, even though he always kind of called himself a typical farmer is the word he'd use, but conventional.
Right.
We were a large family farm. We managed 2 sections of land. A section is 640 acres, I believe.
Right.
So, but even though there might have been shifts and ebbs and flows, Dad's always rotated crops. He's always tried to be as minimum till as we can be in Arizona. It's a little bit different, I know, than in the Midwest because there's more organic matter. Our sun zaps a lot of that organic matter. It's hard to keep it in there. But Are there distinctions, and what would some of those big distinctions be between traditional and regenerative?
Well, you look at a lot of different definitions for regenerative farming, but the fundamental definition a lot of us refer back to is regenerative farming focuses on optimal soil health. And soil health that not only includes just fertility, but also soil structure, soil physical properties, water infiltration, et cetera. And also, regenerative agriculture, one of the arguments sometimes about that is that it claims that there shouldn't be such a heavy focus on yield, that we also need to look at what we would also say as sustainability. Well, I think what we have to do is work on all those points and all those factors in a balanced way. So the factors and the practices you were talking about that Pat Murphy, your father, has implemented, and a lot of the farmers like that. Those are practices that I would say are consistent with a regenerative or sustainable farming system in the context of it's an irrigated crop production system. So there's only so much that you can do with regard to, say, leaf carp cover and minimum tillage and still be able to irrigate efficiently. And that's one of our key goals and objectives in an irrigated system is be able to use every drop of water as efficiently as possible. Therefore, we have to get that water across the field and irrigate effectively and efficiently. And part of crop rotations that takes place, which we want to have for the good soil practices and good crop production practices, also plays against then some of the irrigation methods that people advocate, like drip irrigation. So if you have drip irrigation, which is a great tool, it has its place, but one of the things you have to work around is it limits what you can do in terms of your crop rotations, and we don't want to lose those flexibilities, those capacities. So I would look at someone like your dad and a lot of the farmers I've worked with in Pinal County and that part of Arizona as folks that are working very hard to balance that match between you have to have high yields to stay in business with the marginal profits that these farmers are experiencing with the crop commodity markets and the cost of production that we deal with, and at the same time try to preserve and develop and conserve your soil resources and enhance those and carry those forward for your future as well, from year to year, as well as from generation to generation.
And every region is going to be different, especially every region of the country. And when you look at Southwestern farming compared to Midwest, it has in many ways, it has a total different look.
Well, absolutely, every part of the country.
Yep.
You can even say that in Arizona. You can go from the Colorado River valleys to central Arizona, drastic differences in conditions, differences in practices that would be what we would say appropriate. Go to southeast Arizona, the higher elevations, very different again, et cetera, et cetera. You can do this anywhere, but particularly if you look from region to region, broad regions across the United States. What I find is interesting was I've had a chance in the past 40 years to travel internationally, particularly to arid and semi-arid regions like where we live in Arizona, working in agriculture. And I find that there's, as we say, a lot of different ways to skin the cat. But if farmers are finding that to maintain their productivity in their fields, they're going to have to maintain a common set of practices. And I think everybody learns that they don't survive. They learn the hard way sometimes that we have to maintain crop rotations. We have to maintain these as much as minimum tillage, maintain soil health in a broad, holistic way as much as possible.
Great.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about the differences in water. I think early on in our conversation, you were talking about 24 inches of rain, and I was thinking not too long ago, we were jumping for joy when it was 0.2 of an inch here in Arizona. So lots to consider. Lots to consider. Also, I was reading that you had said 1 gram of agricultural soil contains approximately 1 billion bacterial organisms and 10,000 different species. How does this diversity affect the soil ecosystem?
Oh, that's a great question. This is an interesting point too, is, you go back to the 70s, we were talking about how things have changed. The level of knowledge in the 1970s in soil science and soil microbiology was that the microbiology, the biology, the life component of soils was extremely important. And I'd say that you have to understand there are several facets. Soils aren't just one-dimensional. Soils are literally a living organism, and they're a part of a living entity, and they're a part of our natural terrestrial ecosystems. And they contain, you can break them down to 3 broad categories, how you look at a soil system, and they all vary. There'd be the physical components, like our soil texture, sand, silt, and clay, the way the aggregates or the clods are held together, the general whole array of physical properties. Then there's the second category, which would be the chemistry, What's the general chemical makeup of this soil? Then the third would be the microbiology or the general overall biological construct or populations in the soil. And since this, say, the past, well, 40, 50 years, really in the past 30, that our knowledge and our understanding of that has expanded, I would say exploded over that period of time with regard to our understanding of what's in these soils with regard to these microbial populations. And it's been basically a function of a lot of the new analytical technologies that have been developed. You have GC gas chromatography, mass specs, high throughput genetic analysis and data collection. We call PCR analysis, polymerase chain reactions. Anyway, looking at all the genetic constructs. And then you go like all these organisms, and that's a good way to identify the differentiation of microorganisms is by their genetic construct. As a result of that, this has literally exploded where we say, we realize there's about in 1 gram of soil, on the average, of all kinds of soils, agricultural soils and natural ecosystems, you're going to have, like a billion, in 1 gram, a billion bacterial organisms. And among those, in those individuals, maybe 10,000 species. And along with that, like over 1 million actinomycetes organisms. And along with that, maybe another 1 million viral organisms and fungal organisms. So you realize this is an extremely rich environment. When we talk about diversity, that's one of the greatest zones of diversity on the planet. As a matter of fact, the only place on the planet where there's greater biological diversity than soils is in the oceans.
Wow.
You can take all the biological diversity on the surface of the planet with plants and animals, put them all together, and they don't come close to what the biological diversity is in the soil. But in the soil, we've come to realize that's all in this microbiological array. So where we are right now, it's kind of interesting. We're to the point where we can identify a lot of these species and see that they're there. And then the next question, what we're scientists are really working on it today, is to understand how do they operate together. That's an ecosystem. And how, you go out on a terrestrial ecosystem, terrestrial landscape, you might say, well, you've got a 400, 500, maybe 1,000 species out here, and how they all are functioning together in the ecosystem. And that's one thing. But you transfer that into the soil environment, now this tremendous diversity. It's funny also, I find myself using this term diversity a lot. Everyone in the university these days, we've been told, you can't use that word because now it's, it's a violation of government policy, but it describes the world that we live in. And what we want to encourage is diversity. And really, that's the big factor that we're talking about a lot with soil health and encouraging this kind of regenerative agriculture is to encourage this biological diversity. Because we've recognized the more of that we have, the better off that we are. The problem is like in any ecosystem, you want the right array of species. Then the next question would be, what's that proper balance of speciation in those microorganisms? But Tammy, you bring up the point that's just hard to get your head around, and that is 1 billion in 1 gram of soil, a billion organisms, bacterial organisms alone, not to mention all the other fungal and viral organisms that go along with it. But it's incredible to think about. Really.
So can you foster some of the more favorable organisms for the soil and minimize the others?
Yeah, exactly. Again, and there's a lot of analogies here. We talk about soil health to human health, which we can think about, and we think about that regularly in our own lives for our own self-preservation. But it's the same thing. There are certain practices and certain conditions that would enhance the favorable organisms. Unfavorable organisms, of course, are pathogens, for example. And we do have an issue with plant pathogens. I work with chili production. It's New Mexico type chili production. We have a lot of that in southeast Arizona, extends across what we call the chili belt, across southern New Mexico, far west Texas, and northern Chihuahua, the Republic of Mexico. And one of the biggest problems we have in the chili industry are diseases, plant diseases. And we find that we have to rotate fields, we have to rotate crops. We have to really be very careful that we're moving around so that we don't develop a high population of these pathogenic organisms, the negative organisms like you're talking about. We don't want to do that at all. So it's really important. You learn by trial and error, you learn the hard way. And so it comes back to these same practices. The more you rotate, the better crop rotations you have. Certain crop rotations will enhance the favorable populations of organisms in the soil that we want to have. Now, the real open question is right now, it's a debate. some folks will say, well, we know what those organisms are. If you buy our product, our special ingredient, we have a special solution. It's like the special cereals that you can get and the food additives. Now, this is the special stuff that you need and it's missing and everything else. I'm a little dubious about that we can say we really know that today, but we're going to have that track that you're describing, Tammy, with what are those favorable organisms and what are the practices that encourage those. That's really the point of focus that we need to have as we take that information to the field. But fundamentally, crop rotations and having the proper crop rotations in place, the sequencing of crop rotations is important. And we know there are certain species that enhance that within each crop production system that we have. And I just might stand that as another quick example. What we would do in the Yuma area, for example, in the lower Colorado River Valley, where the center of production is leafy green vegetables. Our leafy green vegetable industry that's so vibrant there in those lower Colorado River valleys. What we do there in terms of crop rotations to address that question about favorable microbial populations and soil health would be different than what we would have in central Arizona. We have a very different cropping system. Primarily it's corn, wheat, cotton, alfalfa, crops like that. That rotation can be favorable. Then we get into the sequencing and try to fit a few other crops into that system to enhance the soil health you're talking about. Good points.
And again, we alluded to this a little bit earlier, that even in the same field, that variation of the soil microbiome can be just dramatically different. So today's technology with soil probes and and literally they can check the soil conditions, especially moisture, on their smartphones and stuff like that. But what I'm getting, and maybe you can drill down on this a little bit more, Dr. Silvertooth, is that from soil to soil, you really need to understand that little community of all of this living matter. I'm going to try to start telling myself every time I'm crunching on even our desert soil that sometimes doesn't seem like there's that much life in it. You're telling me it is a billion per ounce.
Yeah, exactly. I can't help but you kind of laugh in a sad way when people say our soils are dead. These desert soils are dead, and what was ever little life was in them in agriculture, you've killed them. No, they're not. And all you have to do is go out in one of these fields, and you take some of the roughest land that we have. We have some rough conditions in Arizona. We have a lot of I was a soil scientist and agronomist, and I would say they're beautiful soils. There's these alluvial soils that are geologically young, highly fertile. They're tremendous. But some of them are say rough, and they might be high in caliche, low and short and shallow in soil depth. In some places, it's really a lot of sand. But they're alive. They're abundantly alive, and all you have to do to see that is put some organic residues out there, like crop residues. And there's a distinction between organic material, like a crop residue, like you harvest a corn or tomato crop and you take the fruit off and you put the rest of the residue back in. That's organic material. That's not organic matter. And so if we put that organic material in the field, what it has to go through is a digestion, a breakdown. And that's all facilitated by microorganisms. And of course it needs water. Water is the limiting factor. But you put some water and those organisms and that organic material out into the soil, guess what happens? It gets digested. What's happening there? That's not magic. That's not a physical process. It's a biological process. And those organisms come alive. A colleague of mine in what is now the environmental science department. I was a department head there for 12 years in soil, water, environmental science. And so that's why I kept up with a lot of this microbiology movement along, was working with my colleagues there. And one of my colleagues was working on a project in Chile in the Atacama Desert, which is the driest desert in the world. And of course, the question they had was, are these soils dead or void of microorganisms? Because they hardly ever get any rain. There's nothing growing out there. So they went down there, sampled these soils, they bring them back, put a little water in them and incubate them. Boom. They're breathing, they're exchanging gas. Those microorganisms were abundantly alive. And so the same thing happens to us out here, just in a lot lesser case. But we're a richer biological diversity here in our soils compared to that, but that'd be an extreme case like the Atacama Desert.
So it sounds like water is an important factor, especially in these arid
that's
climates.
The key. Yeah, that's the key.
Are there other challenges with the arid climates and soil, or is that the primary thing you need to make?
That's the primary factor. You look at any terrestrial ecosystem, and ecologists will tell you from any ecosystem, around the world, like terrestrial ecosystems, like from forests, grasslands, etc., the first limiting factor mostly will be sunlight because of cloud cover and lack of photosynthesis capacities. Then the second limiting factor becomes water. Well, that's not our scale. Out in the deserts, the arid regions of the world, we have plenty of sunlight, plenty, almost too much. But what the first limiting factor always will become is water. And that's why you look around the world, and here in Arizona, we use 70% of the water in this state. We get criticized for that. The fact of the matter is, the United States, I think, is 70 to 80% as a total now, and that includes production water use as well. But globally, across the entire planet, we use 70% of the fresh water on this planet to produce crops and animals. It goes to agriculture because life requires water. And there's no way getting around the fact that if I want to grow a crop or produce an animal, to keep an animal alive, I have to give them sufficient water to be able to survive and to produce. That's how we live on this planet. It's interesting to know, too, about half the crop production on the planet takes place between 32 degrees north and 32 degrees south latitude in these arid and semi-arid regions of the world. Almost 65, 70% of the total grain production on the planet takes place in these zones. And also, too, close to half the population of the planet lives in those kinds of zones as well. It's not an accident, but what is required and what is required to support us all, the humans, the plants and animals, everything we do in this cycle of life requires water. So that there's no substitute for it. There's no amendment. You're not going to get around that. And you really take this all back to really high school biology. And it's the photosynthesis equation. For every unit of carbohydrate that's produced and around the photosynthesis, it takes 6 units of water. We're a long ways from ever changing that. That's built into the basics of Mother Nature. So all the discussions I hear when people say, "Well, we just need to use lower water consuming crops." Nice idea. It's a very pretty idea. If it only could be feasible for us, because you use less water, you're going to produce less of a crop. That means less of a food product. And we have to support over 8 billion people on this planet today. Well, just 7.4 million right here in Arizona. So water is our key, always.
So, yeah, and to that point, you just taught Tammy and I that applying water and then also using, did you say organic matter and kind of plowing or working that back into the soil, that helps it. But let's just say that the soil for that farmer, and based on what he or she needs their yields to be, still has to apply some fertilizer. And
Right.
a lot of times that's when somebody gets their antenna up. Oh, no, it's not natural. It's not regenerative. But I want to say one time you told me that soil is agnostic. It will take what it needs in order for it to be productive. And sometimes those are fertilizers that we,
Right.
to the uninformed may feel like we're using too many quote unquote chemicals, but everything's a chemical. So,
Right, absolutely. This is a great one. This is a great one. So if you stop and look at this, we've talked about the limiting factors in ecosystems, sunlight in these more humid regions, but water is our number one limiting factor. The number two limiting factor, and the next limiting factor in biological systems and any kind of terrestrial ecosystem is going to be what we call bioavailable nitrogen. And one of the facts that happens here, there's a whole array that really we need to get lined out on this. But first, let's just start right there with what you were just asking. Let's take nitrogen alone. The form of nitrogen that plants take up, as a fact, is nitrate nitrogen. Nitrate nitrogen, and you can draw that out. It's a typical chemical structure, but it's inorganic structure. It's nitrate nitrogen. And plants will take up some ammonium, but not much. Most of the time, they've evolved over millions of years. Across all plant types, they take up nitrate nitrogen through the root system. And if we put on an organic fertilizer or an inorganic fertilizer, the form that plant's going to take up is nitrate nitrogen. So let's say I put on an organic material. They say manure, animal manure, plastic one. Put that out in the field, it'll be broken down by what? Microorganisms. Microorganisms will transition that, break those organic compounds down, separate them out, and break it all down, and finally it comes down when they go through these final steps called ammonification and then nitrification. So it goes into, it gets taken from these large organic compounds, broken down continually until you're into these inorganic constituents like ammonium nitrogen. Plants can't take that out, but more organisms can utilize that nitrogen. They convert that, they oxidize that nitrogen into nitrate, and that's the form the plant can take up. That's a fact. We don't get around that. And the fact of the matter is, too, when I say you say soils are agnostic, well, plants really are too. There's no distinction chemically between the nitrate that came from an organic source, or if I take that manure and contrast that right next in the field next to it with a nitrate source that comes from an industrial fertilizer plant. It's the same thing. The plants can't distinguish that. Nitrate is nitrate chemically. Even and people have a hard time believing that. They want to think that the nitrate that comes from an organic source has some kind of a little halo around it and has a special aura. And it's more holy and it's taken up more preferentially and it makes the plants healthier. And we can taste the difference. No, that's not true. It's not a difference. It's chemically speaking, as nitrate is nitrate. And that's just the way the world is.
Yeah.
You want to be theistic about it. The Lord made it that way, and that's the way it is. It's going to be that way. And so we have to look at the reality and look at the facts of the situation. So here's what we get down to as well. There's nothing evil about inorganic fertilizers. If we look at inorganic fertilizers or commercial fertilizers, it's an efficient way. It's the most efficient way to put out a fertilizer form because we can put it out and actually, particularly in irrigated systems, you can more or less spoon feed that to the plant as you would in a hydroponic or a drip system. And you basically reapply to the soil what is being taken up by the plant and try to be as efficient with that replenishment, with that balance as you can. If I'm out fertilizing with an organic fertilizer, which we've done in organic systems, we have to do, and work and contrast that to a more conventional crop production system where I can use commercial or industrial fertilizers, like nitrogen fertilizers as an example, I can be a lot more efficient in the environment with that nitrogen from an industrial form than I can with an organic form, because I can't control the breakdown process that the microbes carry out as they take that organic compound and break it down. Think of it like this. We do the very same thing. When we eat a food product and we want that for, say, protein, a high protein source, and get a meat source, say a nice beef steak or a hamburger, our body has to break all those compounds down. We don't take in that protein and use it into our system as that protein form. But that protein form that we eat, we consume, is broken down by our body and our gut system and converts it into basic constituents that our body then rebuilds into amino acids, rebuilds into proteins, and all that basic nitrogen that's in there operates the same way as we see in soils and in plants, chemically, biochemically. It's the same, real similar systems. And plants do the very same thing. They take that nitrate and those inorganic sources and they put that together in their own physiological system and build their own proteins, body physical structures, and enzymes and everything else that carries out their biochemical functions on a day-to-day basis from those raw constituents. And we can be more efficient feeding that plant by giving its basic ingredients that it needs to basically carry out its life cycle. Same thing we would do as we have a good balanced diet for ourselves.
Well, Dr. Silvertooth, Tammy now has the nutritional question for you. I'm excited to hear her question on this one.
Well, and I have to say I'm excited that I'll be able to take something from my high school biology and put into practice again.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was going to happen.
We did nothing else today because it's a value from your high school
I'll get to
biology.
pull something out of my past there and utilize it. Nutritionally speaking, though, then, are you saying that if the quality of the soil, the healthier the quality of the soil, then will that translate into a more nutrient-dense fruit or vegetable or product that's being produced in that soil?
In a general sense, yes. And you have to have a healthy soil, and a healthy soil would be one that has a good balance of what we call plant essential nutrients out there. Mm-hmm. And by fact, there's about anywhere from 13 to 17, depending on how you count them, as well as plant essential nutrients. And all essential nutrients that we have on our list, if you look those up, you can Google that up real fast. it's one fundamental fact is that not all plants require all nutrients, and not all nutrients are required by every plant. So we have to look at that somewhat individually. But there's a broad set that are universally required. And a healthy soil has a nice balance of those nutrients in available forms that can be taken up by plants. And that's where we get into this business of soil fertility, which has often been like the centerpiece of how we've discussed soil health in the past. And soil fertility is just simply it's soil chemistry. It involves the microbiology because of the chemical reactions that microbes facilitate with regard to these nutrient compounds that we're interested in, and then how that soil system interacts with the plants in the physiological sense. And that's the core of soil fertility, which is a major piece of what we're describing as soil health. Not the only piece, but a major piece. And this is the reason why, Tammy, is because it fits back into we want to have a healthy crop. We have to have the nutrients in the soil to produce that crop. And there's a definite relationship between the two. The soil is a reservoir for that nutrient base from which the plant derives its essential compounds, its essential nutrients to build itself into a healthy plant. And so if a plant is going to be rich or depleted in a nutrient, I mean, that's coming right out back to the soil. And that's, one of the first things we learn in soil fertility is what are these nutrient deficiency symptoms? And then we get into the complex business of soil fertility, plant nutrition, where we are trying to make assessments of soils, which, you can take a lot of our compounds, a lot of these soils have a lot more, like you can take nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. A lot more of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium in soils that are going to be actually plant available. What we want to try to do is enhance the plant available forms. And so that means we need to understand these chemical processes that change all the bulk of, the bulk of nitrogen that exists in the soil, and how much of that is going to be then into these available forms, particularly that nitrate form I described before. But we can say the same for the full array of essential nutrients. There's the difference between total nutrient in the soil versus plant available nutrient in the soil. And that's one of our challenges in making that assessment, and then trying to encourage that conversion from those non-available forms to plant available forms, so we can encourage and maintain good, healthy plants. I never cease to be amazed by our capacity to do that, knowing, particularly the difficulties we have in arid soils with high pH, some of the conditions that we're dealing with in terms of trying to maintain that balance. But we can do it, but it takes an effort, and it takes an effort every day, and that goes back to good management.
That's fascinating because it's a lot like human nutrition. There are some forms of a nutrient like iron that's much better utilized by the body from beef
exactly.
than it
Right.
would be from a plant source.
Exactly.
So same thing
Exactly.
applicable to plants. That's fascinating.
Exactly.
All of
If I
these-
may, I can give you a great example of that with plants. Iron is a great example. Iron is a great example where the form of iron that's required to be taken up by plants is a Fe2 form. And what we have a lot of times is an Fe3 plus form of it. And it's particularly in high pH soils. We have a lot of these oxidized iron compounds, but that's not directly available to the plant. So we have these high pH conditions, which, very alkaline conditions, and it's not conducive to that available form of iron. So one of the problems we have out here anywhere in the Western United States where you have higher pH, or any part of the world, is iron deficiency. And yet you go in and analyze a soil that might be rich in total iron, but that available iron is going to be relatively small. I come from Oklahoma, and I actually worked with these Oklahoma soils directly on iron. And you have red soils that are red because of the high content of oxidized iron. But the irony is that sometimes those soils are higher pH, and you have iron deficiencies that are real common in some of those soils because of this differential between available form of iron versus a plant available form of iron versus total iron in the soil. And we are the same way, as you say, with regard to human nutrition. Iron is kind of interesting. It's because of the similarities biologically, irrespective of plant or animal, and in terms of that kind of specificity of availability. And it's important to understand that.
So we only have time for 2 more questions, but you have helped us, and every time I listen to you, Dr. Silvertooth, I walk away with so much more understanding and information
Thank you.
along these lines. And soil health equates to soil fruits and vegetables. We've seen that. But the question that I have is, despite some saying, industrial farming has depleted the health of our soils, which we know that's not true, and yours is a boots on the ground. Talk about the last almost 40 years of hanging out with farmers here in Arizona that proves the point and
Well,
even the
yeah.
experiment and research that you've done.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. Very good point, Julie. That's one of the, I think, challenges you have working in a university, particularly working in a position like mine, is we're an extension, we do applied research. So it's not you out in the world and working with farmers and consultants, technicians, people that have literally the boots on the ground every day that are producing these crops. And you've got to be able to relate. You have to be able to communicate the information you have in a palatable way. And the fact of the matter is that you don't have the same kind of conditions you do in a classroom. We have a trapped audience that has to get a grade and they have to pay attention to you and they have to follow the dogma, the doctrine that you lay out. Out in the world in extension with these folks, they know what they're doing. They know their business pretty well. So you have to, spend time with them and figure out what they know. The truth of it is, for me, I've probably learned more from being in the field from working with people than I have contributed. I hope I contribute something of value and being able to be a viable member of the community that way. They count on me to do that. But the truth of it is I've learned a lot. You learn a lot from working with these farmers and working with them out in the world. And the only way you can do that is be on the field.
Right.
And I think anybody that's an agronomist or anybody that's interested in plant production, I get a little frustrated with that at the university sometimes, to be honest with you, is that if you're not spending your time out in the field, you really can't learn and understand what the applications are of this, this knowledge we're trying to put together, which, we've discussed a lot of it here today. But really working with the farmers, working with the people in the field that's the greatest classroom in the world. And I still love doing it. I was in administration. I think I mentioned I was a department head. I was still in the field at that time, but I was a dean and director of extension for 10 years. And I missed doing that. I snuck out for therapy to get in the field as much as possible. And now the past few years, I'm back out kind of rehabilitating, but I really realize when I'm out there, you're constantly learning and things are changing all the time. And these folks are tremendously innovative. And then, kind of cycle around to the core of our discussion here today. That's one of the main things they're all working on is to try to maintain healthy soils. That's why they're interested in the topic. And, we had the Desert Ag Conference here a few weeks ago in Arizona. It was land of April, 1st of May. And the topics that they asked me to discuss, two 1-hour sessions on the soil microbiome. We wouldn't have done that at all 30 years ago. It would have been hard to gain that kind of interest and keep their attention. They turned around and asked me just this morning, I was on the phone with some folks, asked me to come out for another program in about a month to do the same thing. And so it's an example, not just of what I'm doing, but what matching the needs of the folks in the field that are saying, this is important. We want to be able to do this and capitalize on the knowledge that's out there today, the things that we've discussed here today in terms of the expansion of information and put it to good use in the field. And that's how, we can bring this information up, but they'll take it and make it better. And then you learn, you bring back from that, and that's how you build. That's how things improve.
And you definitely have built on it. I promise you, if Dad was sitting right next to me, he'd say, Dr. Silvertooth, you contributed as well. So, well, Tammy.
I hope so. Yeah, a little bit at least.
Tammy, I'll let you ask the last question for this episode.
Well, this has all been fascinating. Thank you so much for all this information. It's given us a lot to think about, and it's been great. And I love that you like being out in the field. And related to that, you really do emphasize the importance of soil testing.
Right.
How does that contribute then to having that ideal, healthy soil?
Yeah, very good question. What we do in terms of soil testing is important because the soil tests that are appropriate out here in these arid regions, these arid soils, is different than it would be in other parts of the country. And so we have soil tests that are appropriate here. And what we also have to do is look at the soil tests. And most soil tests will take a soil sample and extract from that some fraction of the total nutrient in that soil that we were trying to estimate as its plant available form that I was describing earlier. And so you can do that with nitrogen. Nitrogen is kind of tough because of the constant these microbes are making these changes, and it's such a flux all the time. So a nitrogen test is kind of a snapshot what's in there today, but you can look at overall nitrogen content and make estimates. But the others are the inorganic nutrients like phosphorus, potassium, the micronutrients. And what we're trying to do with our soil test extractions, our soil test methods, is pull out the estimate the best estimate possible for plant available forms from that total form. And those soil tests that we would use for that are unique out here in the desert Southwest and different than what it might be in the Great Plains or even the San Joaquin Valley and some of the coastal valleys of California. So it's important to know what the soil test labs are doing. Are they using the appropriate methods? And then another really big part of that is I can take a soil sample and run it into the lab, take an extraction and get out a number of value for this parts per million of phosphorus or potassium, per gram of soil. But the question would be, what does that mean in terms of the crop that I'm trying to grow? A corn crop, a lettuce crop, cotton, alfalfa, etc. And each of these crops are going to have different uptake requirements and different relationships. And so it has to be what we call correlated. Yeah, there's got to be a correlation to what I pull out in the value in a soil test to what the plant needs. And then we need to calibrate it. And then the calibration means, all right, if I come up with a certain level that shows I'm less than 100% sufficient to support this crop need, what's the amount of nutrient that I need to apply to make that difference? And that changes in relation to the amount of that nutrient that's plant available in the soil. That comes back to our soil test. So the soil test that we have is a challenge of really threefold to Tammy. Is first of all the right method to be appropriate for the soil conditions, the chemical, the pH conditions of the environment that extract out some estimate of plant available nutrient. The next step would be, is that indexed or is that calibrated properly to what the plant needs are? Then the third part is it calibrated with regard, is it correlated first and is it calibrated then, just so we know if at this level of nutrient that we extract, how much of an additional nutrient in a fertilizer form do we need to apply to be efficient to meet that plant need? So soil tests are valuable tools, but I think they need to be used properly, and folks have to watch out for that because someone might have a great soil test and give you a good number. What does that mean? Has it been correlated and calibrated with regard to what I need to do in the field? Sometimes they have, sometimes they haven't. So we have to watch for that. But those three parts are really important to consider.
And that is so perfect for what we're trying to learn here. Healthy soil equates to healthy fruits and vegetables.
Absolutely.
And I love that we ended with this measuring and testing the soil. And Dr. Silvertooth, my conclusion is America has healthy soil. We're testing it. We're doing good things. And we're producing healthy fruits and vegetables.
And my takeaway really is that technology has advanced so much, actually, the soil may be even healthier than it was in the past for the particular crops that are being grown.
Good point. Good point.
In some respects, and I would say one last thing I would add to that is that we have to keep working at it.
Yep.
We're never at a static point. So anytime we back off, it's going to be a problem. I'd also say too, all of the interest in soil health, all of the interest in regenerative agriculture, I applaud it vigorously.
Yes.
And I like to see that because it helps us understand this better, just as we would, to bring that analogy back as we began, back to our own personal human health. The better we understand our own complete operation of our body with regard to all functions, same thing with the soil, how do they all operate together in concert, and how we maintain that soil health collectively is very important for us to do. So I applaud that whole effort to try to understand and study soil health, and then regenerative agriculture fits right into that. But the core is soil health. Healthy soils make healthy crops help healthy people.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Silvertooth.
Thank you so much.
I think we're going to have you back. I hope you are willing. And
I'll be delighted to.
Yes. And
Thank you.
just know that we so appreciate everything you do, not only on behalf of the university, on behalf of our farmers, and also on behalf of Extension. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for the good work you do in helping. And thank you for the opportunity to visit with you today. I've enjoyed it.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much. That was
Good discussion.
fantastic.
Thank you.